I now would like to invite President and founder of the Middle East Forum, Daniel Pipes, to introduce our next speaker.
Again, thank you, Congressman, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is our finale. Jonathan Spire earlier today thanked the Monaco Hotel for the keffiyeh design. I want to note the Egyptian octagon above us. They're keeping us warm in the Middle East here. Elliott Abrams arrived and said he's in a good mood because he found a parking space. So look forward to an optimistic, happy talk. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce him. He and I met in college in 1968. And over the subsequent year, we forged an alliance in battling the new left and the old left. That is the weed-smoking Students for Democratic Society, or SDS, and the crew-cut Stalinists of progressive labor. Progressive labor tends to be forgotten, but it was, in fact, more deadly than SDS. They're the Maoists and Stalinists. Through the subsequent decades, he and I have remained friends, even though he did not completely appreciate my criticisms of the George W. Bush policy in Iraq. I've closely followed his distinguished intellectual and political career and would like briefly to summarize it for you now. He was born in New York City in 1948, received his BA degree from Harvard in 1969, a master's degree from LSE, London School of Economics, and a JD from Harvard Law in '73. He practiced law and spent 4 years working in the US Senate for two very distinguished Democratic senators, Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, and Daniel Moynihan. Dismayed by Jimmy Carter, he joined Democrats for Reagan and joined the Reagan administration, serving for all 8 years as Assistant Secretary of State and in 3 different bureaus: international organizations, human rights, and Latin America. Not only did Secretary of State George Shultz award him the Distinguished Service Award, but he was the youngest Secretary of Assistant, get this right, Assistant Secretary of State in American history. And in 1982, he formally switched parties from Democratic to Republican. Leaving government, he was a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and then president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center before joining George W. Bush's White House staff in 2001. Again, he spent all 8 years in the administration, again in 3 positions, but this time at the National Security Council, first in the Democratic Human Rights and International Organizations, and then Near East and North Africa, and finally Deputy National Security Advisor. So he switched quietly from Latin America to the Middle East. During the Obama years, he joined the Council on Foreign Relations as a senior fellow for the Middle East. When Trump came to office, it appeared that Elliot would become Deputy Secretary of State. But the president had other ideas. He nixed the appointment. I remember the article he wrote in Weekly Standard. It got him nixed. Despite this, he rejoined the State Department for 2 years, 2019 to 21, as special representative, first just for Venezuela, and then he also got the Iran portfolio. Since then, he has returned to the Council on Foreign Relations, again as Middle East senior fellow. In addition to these many full-time jobs, Elliot has been both a member and the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and a member of the advisory board for the Middle East Partnership for Peace at the USAID. He's published 5 books on a range of subjects: Undue Process, which was about the Iran-Contra affair, where he had unfortunate experience; Security and Sacrifice, about the American role after the Cold War; Faith or Fear, How Jews Can Survive in a Christian America; Tested by Zion, the Bush administration and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And finally, Realism and Democracy, American Foreign Policy After the Arab Spring. My favorite fact about Elliott's long career, on which he will reflect for us this evening, that Ariel Sharon, in late 2003, revealed to him, as the very first American, his plan to withdraw all Israelis, military and civilian, from Gaza. To which I asked, Elliot, couldn't you change his mind? This evening, he has agreed to reflect on his nearly half-century in Washington, in and out of government, with a sprinkling of war stories and an emphasis on the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Elliott Abrams.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all. It's really a great pleasure to be introduced by Daniel. As he said, we met, I would have said 67, but you said 68. That's okay. This was the moment of the great Harvard strike that year. And Daniel and I were among the people who formed an organization called the Ad Hoc Committee to Keep Harvard Open. It was our first right-wing conspiracy. And I've been thinking today that we ought to meet later or tomorrow to form an organization called the Ad Hoc Committee to Close Harvard Down. As Daniel said, after college and law school, I came down here. I worked for Jackson and Moynihan, Reagan, Bush, Trump. Daniel, of course, went his own way, and in doing so, he compiled a really fabulous group of enemies. Rashid Khalidi, The Nation magazine, Chris Dodd, Mearsheimer and Walt, Ted Kennedy. I could go on, but I think probably all of you here are in paroxysms of envy over this enemies list. It's wonderful. It is odd that we both ended up concentrating on the Middle East. He, of course, very much earlier than was true of me. The thing about Daniel is he knew far too much about the Middle East to be a professor, so he had to found the Middle East Forum. I knew nothing about the Middle East, so I had to become a high government official. I have been working on the region now for about 20 years, more than 20 years, and preparing for this, Daniel did ask me to reflect on anything I've learned. And to keep it short, I thought I would just talk about three key lessons from these decades in Washington. The first is dinners are very important. You know, people always are more relaxed, more willing to speak, even without alcohol. And the subject matter may be interesting, even if it isn't important, or it may be very important. One example, in January 2008, I accompanied President Bush, George W. Bush, on his visit to Saudi Arabia, where we met with King Abdullah, first at his palace in Riyadh, and then at his so-called horse farm called Al Janadriya. It was a simple place, and it had only 50 bedrooms. So not our entire party couldn't fit, obviously, and some had to stay in Riyadh, but I was there overnight, and at dinner I found myself sitting right across the table from the king. And I thought, what am I going to talk to him about? You actually may be guessing, but you'll never guess, so I'll tell you. Queen Elizabeth. This was a horse farm. And I said to him, tell me something. Does Queen Elizabeth actually know anything about horses? That set him off for about 20 minutes discussing his relationship with Queen Elizabeth and her horses. Great fun. No importance whatsoever. Daniel mentioned another dinner that was important, and that was November 18th, 2003. I met secretly in Rome with Prime Minister Sharon. His protection details sneaked me in through the garage to the Cagliari Hilton, and we sat down to dinner. And I thought, this hotel is going to give us the best Italian meal they can possibly gin up. But no, the waiters came in with trays of meat, slabs of meat on platters, and as soon as they left, Sharon really dug in. Tucked his napkin into his neck, and he dug in. Now, in the center of the table was a kind of round, pink piece of meat, and we're in Italy. And as he grabbed at it, I said to him, Prime Minister, what meat do you think that is? And as he began to cut it, he said to me, Elliot, sometimes it is better not to ask. After dinner, and conversation took place after dinner. Sharon is very serious about meals. But after dinner, he did say, I've made this decision about Gaza. There's no future for Israelis in the middle of a couple of million Palestinians. So dinners can actually be critically important. I have never heard a Jordanian official in his office refer to the Jordanians of Palestinian origin as anything other than Jordanians of Palestinian origin. But at dinner, I have never heard a Jordanian official refer to them as anything other than Palestinians. I have never heard a Jordanian official say anything about a Palestinian state except we demand it. But at dinner, especially if it's late, you have some booze, I have never heard a Jordanian official express anything but fear about the prospect of a Palestinian state, which they know as well as we do would be a Hamas state. So that's lesson one. Dinner, important. Lesson two, kind of related. What is diplomacy? In my experience, most often, diplomacy is what you do when you are afraid of acting. That is, it's what you do when you're afraid of doing anything. It's a substitute for action rather than its prelude. In late 2008, Tony Blair came to the Oval Office to say goodbye to President Bush. And they discussed the failed efforts to get an Israeli-Palestinian deal and the failed efforts to reform the Palestinian Authority. And Blair said, you know, the mistake we made was we spent too much time on diplomacy. He said, quote, reality on the ground will shape an agreement, not vice versa. Again, reality on the ground will shape an agreement, not vice versa. It's an important lesson. I wish they taught it at the Foreign Service Institute and the Kennedy School at Harvard and whatever is now the name of the Woodrow Wilson School. I know we are not allowed to say Woodrow Wilson anymore. I think you should get 1 full course credit for writing on the blackboard 200 times. Reality on the ground will shape an agreement, not vice versa. I'm not against conferences. I'm absolutely not against conferences. Conferences have taken me to Geneva, Paris, London, Florence, Oslo. I mean, conferences are really great. And sometimes at a conference, you get to have dinner. Right, and you can actually do some real business. But the real art of diplomacy is negotiating hard to advance and protect your country's interests, and that doesn't happen at conferences. All of these graduate schools teach negotiating. They all have a class on negotiating, but the classes are taught by professors. If I wanted to teach negotiating in one of those graduate schools, I would not let any professors near the place. I would bring in divorce lawyers. I would bring in real estate investors. I would bring in literally horse traders. And I would bring in used car dealers. They can teach negotiating. Enough said. Third lesson, final lesson, is about the use of power. American strength and willpower are feared and respected when they are used, and we are mocked when we are afraid to use them. A couple of examples. 1985, our satellites found that revetments for MiG jet aircraft were being built in Sandinista, Nicaragua. We told the Soviets, and I must say this is one of my favorite moments in my career. I had the job of telling the Soviets, you may not do that. We will not tolerate Russian MiG jets in Central America. If you put them in, we will take them out. And my colleague who handled Latin America for the Soviet Foreign Ministry said, you know, are you threatening the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? And I said, no, I'm just telling you in advance what the American reaction is going to be. The Sandinistas never got combat jets. 2019, we had intelligence suggesting that Iranian missiles were going to be put in Venezuela, missiles that had the range to reach the United States. And we told them that is not acceptable. We will attempt to stop them at sea, to interdict the shipments. If we fail and the missiles arrive, we will deal with them in Venezuela. Unsurprisingly, they never sent the missiles. Last example, 2020. We saw a rising tide of attacks by Iranian proxies on Americans in Syria and Iraq. So in late summer, we passed some messages through various channels, military and diplomatic, to Iran, saying, if an American is killed, we will hit back against you. Not proxies in Western Iraq, not proxies in Syria, you, Iran. Attacks plummeted from 33 in July through September to 4 in October through December. American power is taken very seriously by our enemies. American restraint is taken very seriously by the New York Times. In my own interactions with Latin American officials and Middle Eastern officials, I've always found that the use of that power does not generate resentment. It generates caution from our enemies and gratitude and relief from our friends. The very last thing we need to worry about is throwing our weight around. excessively, as if people like Putin or Xi Jinping, the Ayatollah Khamenei, were dealing with, well, Elizabeth Warren or Tony Blinken. Very sadly, international politics remains a jungle. We are a big beast in that jungle, a great lion. And when we behave in a way that suggests we will protect ourselves, if you'll pardon the double entendre, protect our pride, and we will protect the weaker beasts around us, we gain respect and support and strength. So that is the third lesson. It's odd that that lesson is controversial, but it is controversial. I doubt that that is what's being taught at these schools of international affairs or the Foreign Service Institute. I doubt that students leave those places with a deep understanding of American power, with a deep understanding that American power is all that stands between the free peoples of the world and a world run by China and Russia and Iran and their partners in aggression and tyranny. You know all that. You know all that because you support the Middle East Forum and you read the Middle East Quarterly. And you've learned, as I have, from Daniel and Martin Kramer and Michael Rubin, Dennis McCune, Ephraim Karsh, Jonathan Spire, so many others, all the many luminaries who have served on its board of editors and written for it over the years. And I salute all of them. And now I think we need to get to work on that ad hoc committee to close Harvard down. Thank you.